Virtual meetings are a new way of life, but they aren't the only success born of the COVID shutdowns. From swimming pools to vaccine billionaires.
Would you have guessed that the home sales industry would be doing so well?
No, I would not have. I thought people would be more hesitant.
This week, a look at businesses that boomed amid the pandemic.
Record tides and storm surges are threatening some of America's most beautiful cities.
Our relationship to the water is sort of why we exist. We've always battled flooding and water.
We look at some billion-dollar projects to build seawalls that may save some cities, or, as some claim, maybe billion-dollar boondoggles.
And we go north to Alaska, a state flush with cash that's paying people to live there.
It just makes lots of people happy.
We visit a village where the midnight sun isn't the only bright spot about living in the Arctic.
Welcome to Full Measure. I'm Sharyl Attkisson. The pandemic shutdowns have left us with fewer jobs, more people on unemployment, and rising household debt. But as destructive as it's all proven to be for so many, there are winners to be found in the COVID economy. Today, we examine the dollars and cents behind some of the booming industries that have found themselves well positioned for catastrophe. The silver lining in the COVID economy is reflected in swimming pools. In 2019, American homeowners spent $3.9 billion building 78,000 new pools. But in 2020, while drowning in COVID, we spent $5.4 billion on 96,000 pools, a record 24% growth for the industry. Today, there's still so much demand, there's a backlog.
Well, some people were just positioned for a catastrophe.
Economist Peter Marisi says it's clear the COVID shutdowns have spurred transformative changes in the American economy and society.
We had the same thing with World War II. I mean, radar is nothing but television. And television was languishing in the late 30s, waiting to happen. All the burst of usage during the war of those kinds of technologies caused it to just burst right after World War II.
During World War II, a device called the cavity magnetron generated microwaves for advanced radar war technology.
Electronics are opening up great new fields of endeavor and opportunity.
After the war, the technology was used to develop microwave ovens, then networks to send TV signals.
And that was really transformative. Television became a major part of American culture. It could do things that the newsreels, at the movies, and the radio couldn't do. Likewise, Zoom is transformative, or Meets, or all these collaborative technologies.
Almost overnight, it seemed, video conferencing took on a role in nearly every aspect of American life. Zoom users increased from 10 million to 300 million. In 2019, Zoom's pre-tax profits were $16 million. In 2020, that number shot up nearly 4,000% to $660 million, with even bigger increases this year. A related phenomenon, remote medical care.
There's a lot of things that doctors used to do by telephone back when I was a kid in the 50s. Then we got into an era of insurance and payments were controlled and all that. And the only way you got paid in that system was if you showed up at the office. Well, insurance companies, Medicare decided to go along with telemedicine, that is, medicine by telephone and video.
In 2019, total revenue of the top 60 virtual health companies added up to about $3 billion. In 2020, it was $5.5 billion. This year, 84% of doctors are still offering virtual visits. Other industries found themselves on a much publicized roll during COVID shutdowns. In a typical year, Americans spend $9 billion on toilet paper. But in 2020, the industry found itself flush with cash and $11 billion in spending. And hand sanitizer jumped from 2019 sales of $200 million to $1.4 billion in 2020, a clean 600% increase. A lot of COVID changes and profits centered on food. The restaurant industry was devastated, with 110,000 dining outlets reportedly shuttered. But in many U.S. locations, fast food icon McDonald's never closed and was all set with drive-through, takeout, and delivery.
They were positioned. They've had a drive-in culture since the 60s, so people that would go inside and sit down just got on the drive-in line. McDonald's is equipped to essentially deliver sandwiches through those windows more efficiently than at the counter.
Instead of losing money, McDonald's same-store sales in the U.S. rose slightly in 2020. U.S. franchisees made more money too, hitting all-time highs, increasing operator cash flow by nearly $40,000 per store. With dining out options limited, we bought more at the local grocery. Consumers proved willing to shell out to have store employees do the actual shopping and deliver the groceries or serve them up curbside.
People end up paying 20 to 40% more for their groceries, and I was surprised they were willing to pay for it. But I know people that did it.
In 2019, grocery store retail sales were $693 billion. In 2020, they reached $773 billion, with the boom continuing this year.
I don't know what to make for dinner.
The meal kit home delivery business also got a big boost. In 2019, HelloFresh struggled with a net loss of $445 million. In 2020, it posted a $446 million net profit and is still beating expectations in 2021. And we drank plenty too, just not as much at the local bar.
Alcohol sales did well but it depended again whether you were selling to bars or you were selling to people in their homes that they consumed at home. Alcohol sales did do well for people that consumed at home.
In 2019, beer, wine, and liquor stores pulled in $56.8 billion. In 2020, they were toasting a $10 billion increase to $66.8 billion. Spirit sales have remained high this year. America's hospitals became pivotal during the pandemic. At many of them, admissions were down, but major hospital chains recorded profits with help from U.S. taxpayers. In 2019, community health systems had a net loss of $675 million. That turned into a net income of $511 million in 2020. The company got $448 million in taxpayer money from COVID relief funds. Universal Health Services ended 2019 with about $815 million net income. In 2020, that shot up to $944 million. UHS got $413 million in COVID money. University of Pittsburgh Medical Center had $420 million in revenue after expenses in 2019. That shot up to $1 billion in 2020. The company got $1.1 billion in taxpayer COVID relief funds. And America's largest hospital system, HCA, made $1.1 billion in profits in 2019, but ended 2020 with $3.8 billion. HCA got a whopping $6 billion in COVID-19 relief funds, but ultimately decided to return the taxpayer money. Few bank accounts swelled more than those of big players in the vaccine industry, which got at least $12 billion of U.S. tax money to develop and produce vaccines. Moderna received nearly $1 billion tax dollars related to vaccine development, then got $1.5 billion more for the first 100 million doses. Pfizer passed up federal funds to develop its COVID vaccine, though it's said to have benefited from taxpayer-funded research, and taxpayers gave Pfizer $2 billion for the first 100 million doses. The pandemic even reportedly made 9 new vaccine billionaires worth a combined $19.3 billion. Moderna's CEO, chairman, top investors, and vaccine producer, CEO of BioNTech, Pfizer's vaccine partner, and 3 founders of China's vaccine manufacturer, CanSino Biologics. But perhaps one of COVID's biggest surprises turned out to be America's housing boom.
Would you have guessed that the home sales industry would be doing so well?
No, I would not have. I thought people would be more hesitant and afraid, but we quickly sorted out. within about 3 months was that we were going to be at this for a long time.
How big is the boom? In 2019, 6.53 million existing and new homes sold. In 2020, that number topped 7 million. Today, they're still on an upward trend. More places to build all those pools. The Christmas forecast is out, and not counting cars, gas, and restaurants, retail sales for this month and next month are forecast to grow up to 10.5% over last year for a record $859 billion. Ahead on Full Measure, questions about taxpayer billions spent to hold back the sea. Decades from Maine to Florida, taxpayer billions have been spent on efforts to try to hold back the sea from rising tides and hurricanes with questionable success. Lisa Fletcher reports from Charleston, South Carolina on plans for and concerns about a sea change.
Hurricane Joaquin, Hurricane Matthew, and Hurricane Irma. 3 consecutive storms to hit Charleston, South Carolina. The storm surge and tidal flooding hammered the historic city.
Charleston was founded in 1670 and ever since has been in a battle with the sea. I'm standing on a seawall that was built in the 19th century, and it's done a pretty good job of protecting these homes from the water. But as sea levels continue to rise and storms become more frequent, the new battle for Charleston is figuring out how to protect it as we move into the 21st century.
Average high tide here is about 5.5 feet. And between 2019 and 2020, 157 tides reached flood stage of 7 feet. It took nearly 60 years prior to that for the same number of damaging tides to occur.
So this is what we call high battery.
Those projections preoccupy Winslow Hasty, president and CEO of the historic Charleston Foundation.
Our relationship to the water is sort of why we exist. It's sort of what put Charleston on the map and made it such an important economic center for the entire South. We've always battled flooding and water, but it's just the increased intensity of the storms and the increased frequency.
Hurricanes and high tides are part of living on the coast, but the rising tides and threat level have led to a proposal by the Army Corps of Engineers to build a man-made structure in Charleston to combat Mother Nature. It's all part of the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018, which released more than $100 million taxpayer dollars to study solutions to reduce damage caused by coastal flooding. The current strategy calls for a wall stretching around parts of the historic city's 8-mile perimeter, reaching as high as 12 feet, costing taxpayers more than $1 billion. The Army Corps experts say it would reduce flooding like this, simulated in this video, replicating a nearly 13-foot tidal surge pushed into Charleston by Hurricane Hugo in 1989.
Is the community embracing this idea of a seawall?
It's really interesting, and it depends on who you talk to. A lot of people, their knee-jerk reaction is, A, this is way too expensive. How are we going to be able to accomplish this? B, we're going to neglect other areas of the city. So people that don't live on the peninsula are very concerned that we're going to eat up all our resources just protecting this.
Questions Charleston City Council member Mike Seekings is also asking.
We have a number of different needs. Do we put all our eggs in one basket and build a wall around the city, 8.7 miles long, 12 feet high, to the exclusion of other things?
Seekings represents a large portion of residents living in the city's historic district.
A couple, $3 billion for a wall that doesn't deal with sea level rise, that doesn't deal with higher tides, and that has some challenges when it comes to stormwater is something we're going to have to really weigh.
So it sounds like you're not against the broader idea of protecting the city from storm surge and sea level rise. You're just not sure this is the right plan?
Right. Is it smart? And one of the things we have to do is we have to manage water. And when you build a wall to stop water from coming in, that isn't necessarily water management. That's water retardation.
As the Army Corps nears the end of a multi-year study on flood mitigation and talking about a purchase price of $1.1 billion, with projections once as high as $3 billion with no guarantees it's going to work, Charleston residents may well have reason to question the seawall project. 2 years ago, we visited an Army Corps project in New Orleans at a cost of $14 billion. It's one of the largest public works projects in history. Because of rising seas and shrinking levees, the Army Corps now says this massive project will no longer protect the city in as few as 4 years. Something Lieutenant General Honore, who managed relief efforts in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, told me 2 years ago.
So you expect the levees to fail?
It's not if, it's when. Because they're made out of dirt and rock and concrete, and they can be overmatched either by rainfall or by water surge coming in from the Gulf.
And the price tag of any protection is growing. In the next 18 years, according to one study, protecting all coastal cities in the U.S. with seawalls would require $400 billion. Right now, Miami is considering an Army Corps project with a price tag of more than $6 billion for a 20-foot seawall cutting through one of Miami's most fashionable waterfront districts. The Army Corps declined an interview about the proposal with Full Measure, citing as a reason the project study is not complete. Considering seawater management projects have unreliable results, it begs the question, are they worthy of taxpayer dollars?
Number one priority for sure is public safety and making sure that we are protected, but it has to be done in a way that's realistic and that's consistent with who we are as an old and historic and very important city.
And cautions Winslow Hasty, consistent with the historic beauty of Charleston.
When you think about the Army Corps of Engineers, you don't think about aesthetics. How can you marry the two so it is functional yet doesn't distract from the things that make this such a beautiful tourist destination?
That is the key question, is how we can insert such a huge and I would argue important piece of infrastructure into a very fragile and historic sort of environment. That's sort of our role, honestly, and the role of the residents and the broader community here is to really hold the Army Corps' feet to the fire.
The next phase of the project, aesthetics. What a seawall would look like in a city that lives on her looks. That may be more important than the $400 million Charleston may have to contribute to building the wall. For Full Measure, I'm Lisa Fletcher in Charleston.
Coming up on Full Measure, getting paid to live in the final frontier. Not many people get a check just for the act of living and breathing, but there's at least one place where that's the case. Scott Thuman takes us there.
With its mountain ranges, glaciers, and wilderness, Alaska is rightly known as the last frontier. Bigger than Texas, California, and Montana combined, but with a population of just 725,000. Living here, especially in the winter, can be tough and expensive, with so much having to be shipped in. Though at least there's a financial benefit that comes from being a resident. The state of Alaska actually pays its people. Except for felons, every resident from newborns to seniors gets a check each fall. This year's $1,114. Here in Kotzebue, a small native community inside the Arctic Circle, folks like Frank and Esther Davidovics, sitting retired outside their small fish camp, tell us it is a lifeline.
It just makes lots of people happy. I mean, they buy food for their kids and pay rent and everything.
But you need it, right? I mean, living here is expensive.
Look at the prices. Look at the gallon of milk. It's expensive.
Calling life here expensive is an understatement. At the local supermarket, the prices are eye-watering. Bread at $8.99. For a quarter gallon of milk, $4.99. And a simple can of soup, 3 times what you'd pay in the lower 48 states. Here, grocery bills can easily be 50% higher than the national average, and utilities even more, says Sonny Hadley, out for errands on his ATV.
I'd fill up my fuel tank, and I'll be okay for all the way till February, March.
So you need that money to heat the house?
Yeah, I use it, and my daughter puts part of her dividend into the house also. You know, it helps out a lot.
So where does all that cash come from? In a word, oil. Significant reserves were first identified in the 1950s, and by the early 70s, the state treasury was taking in millions, prompting lawmakers to create a savings account funded by oil to preserve Alaska's wealth. As of late this year, the so-called permanent fund was worth more than $80 billion. And since 1982, yearly dividend checks have been sent to residents. You've got large companies from around the world that come in here and get their hands on this oil. So do you think it's only fair that you all get a cut of that?
Yeah, it's fair, yeah. It's nice because, you know, we own that land, Alaska, you know, and everything, and they get the royalties and give everybody a chunk of it, which is nice.
Another way Alaska, beyond those beautiful views, continues to stand out. For Full Measure, I'm Scott Thuman in Kotzebue.
One note, a recent downturn in fortune for America's oil industry, with oil production now on the decline, has some Alaska politicians insisting it's time for big changes, including adding an income tax. After a break, what's ahead next week on Full Measure? A follow-up to our report on the pitched battle over critical race theory in Loudoun County, Virginia. One of the school board members at the center of the controversy, Beth Bartz, has resigned from the school board. Bartz was the subject of a parent recall petition. Last month, a judge denied her attempt to dismiss the recall. The judge also removed Loudoun County's Commonwealth attorney, Buddha Bibaraj, from involvement in the case. Bibaraj, Bartz, and 5 other school board members were revealed to have been part of a controversial Facebook group that targeted parents who are against critical race theory. Coming up next week on Full Measure, states across the U.S. are passing laws legalizing marijuana in direct violation of federal law. Yet the IRS is happy to collect big bucks off the profits.
To be honest with you, the United States government, they have been the biggest drug dealer in cannabis per se, because they've made the most money out of anybody.
The conflicting laws on weed coming to a head next week on Full Measure. And if you want to hear more stories, check out our podcast, Full Measure After Hours, wherever you like to listen. Until then, we'll be searching for more stories that hold powers accountable.